students, welcome you back in geological knowledge. So today we will discuss a very important topic that is related to hydrogeology or the groundwater geology. The basic differences or the concepts of groundwater, the water table and the flow systems. So we will go for only the conceptual part and the related and the some other part, that is the numerical part as well as some other diagrammatic part, we will discuss in another video. So let's start our discussion. So firstly we will talk about the subsurface water, the surface water as well as the subsurface water. So the groundwater, when we talk about the hydrogeology or the groundwater geology, so we are basically uh, talking about the subsurface water that is flowing under the earth. Okay, so water beneath the land surface that occurs in two principal zones. So these are very important zones, that is the unsaturated zone and the saturated zone. And the previous lecture or the previous slide, in which previous discussion, when we were talking about the the occurrence of groundwater in the objective geology, we have talked about the occurrence of groundwater, where we have talked that the beneath most land areas the groundwater that occurs in especially three important zones. So these are the zones of zone of aeration, capillary fringes and zone of saturation. So we have also talked the basic differences, that what is the quality and quantity of water, in which type of environment the water relates, and we have also talked about the vadose zone, vadose water, and the phreatic zone or the phreatic water, and some concept about the capillary fringes. So we are not going into the detail, but if we talk about only the basic part, so in unsaturated zone, the voids, that is the space between grains of gravel, sand, silt and clay, and some cracks with rocks, contain both air and water. So in the unsaturated zone or the zone of aeration, the zone of aeration that extends from the groundwater, the ground surface down to the capillary fringe. Okay, and this is the unsaturated zone, in which the pore spaces of the rocks, they are partly filled with the air and partly filled with the water. So the rainwater that move vertically downwards to the water table, that passes through the zone of aeration. So a certain amount of water that is always held in the smaller pore spaces due to the molecular attraction processes. So all the water which exists in the zone of aeration, that is known as vadose water or vadose zone. And capillary fringe, we have already talked about the position of the capillary fringe is in between the zone of aeration and the zone of saturation. So capillary fringe can be also defined as the marking or the demarcating boundary between zone of aeration and zone of saturation, which distinguish between aeration and the saturation zone. Water table in this zone that is connected with the zone of saturation and that is raised above it by the capillary forces. Because of the capillary forces acting onto the water bodies, so the zone of saturation is raised above it by capillary forces. So in coarse grained soils, the capillary water that rises only a few centimeters above the water table, not up to very subsequently high height. But in case of the fine grained soils or fine grained clays, it may rise up to a height of 10 to 15 meters. So that is very important key term or very important fact about the capillary fringes. Okay, that is the water that is contained that grows up to the height of 10 to 15 meters in case of fine grained sediments. Okay, and we have already also talked about the zone of saturation, so that extends from the water table downwards. In this zone, all the pore spaces of rocks, they are completely filled with water. There is no space for air. So as the openings in the rocks they decrease with the depth, the lower limit of the zone of saturation that is commonly found within a few hundred meters of the earth surface. Okay, so that was about the zone of aeration, capillary fringe and zone of saturation. That we have already talked in the objective geology series. In the first video we have already talked about these things. So now we will go for further discussion, that is, although in the considerable amount of water can be present in the unsaturated zone. Okay, because in the zone of aeration the pore spaces they are partly filled with the air and partly with the water. Okay, so that's why considerable amount of water that can be present in the unsaturated zone depending upon the ratio of water and air. If the water content is more, so the air content that will be less. Okay, this water cannot be pumped by wells because it's held too tightly by the capillary forces. We cannot pump that water easily because the capillary forces they held that water so tightly. But the upper part of the unsaturated zone, that is the soil water zone. So the soil zone that is crisscrossed by roots, voids which are left by the decayed roots and animals and worm burrows, okay, which enhance the infiltration of precipitation into the soil zone. So these insects like the plant roots, the voids which are left by the decayed roots and the animal and worm burrows, so they enhance the filtration process of the precipitation into the soil zone in the zone of aeration. So soil water is used by the plants in life functions and transpiration, but it also can be evaporate, but it can evaporate directly to the atmosphere because of the process of evaporation. So this is a diagrammatic description. So water table is the upper surface of the saturated zone. We have already talked. So water table meets surface water bodies at or near the shoreline or surface water. If the water surface water body is connected to the groundwater system. So as you can see in the diagram, the zone of unsaturated zone and the water table zone. So unsaturated zone that is also known as the soil water zone, and the saturated zone that is completely filled with the water or the groundwater. In real sense, the saturated zone water that is known as groundwater. Okay, in contrast to the unsaturated zone, the voids in the saturated zone they are completely filled with water. We have already discussed. Water in the saturated zone that is referred to as groundwater in real sense because there is no space for air. The upper surface of saturated water that is referred as water table. The upper limit of the zone of saturation that is known as water table. Okay, so it can be defined a gently curved surface, not a straight line. We have already discussed in the previous discussion of objective geology series. Okay, below the ground at which the vadose zone ends and the saturation zone begins. So that also marks the boundary between zone of aeration and zone of saturation, and it represents the level to which the well would fill with the water. Okay, so below the water table the water pressure is great enough to allow water to enter the wells, thus permitting the groundwater to be withdrawn for use. Okay, a well is constructed by intersecting a pipe into the drilled holes, a screen that is also attached generally at its base. Okay, so well, the construction of well that is done by inserting a pipe into a drilled hole, and that a screen has also been attached, and generally at its base, to prevent earth material from entering the pipe along with the water pumped through the screen. Okay, so we are discussing only the basics only. We will go for the details of the each and every topic, but today is only the basic part in order to make you aware about the basic terms and their description. The depth to which the depth due to the water table, that is highly variable, and that can range from zero, where when it's at land surface, to hundreds or even thousands of feet in some types of landscapes. So the depth of water table, that is highly variable. That's why we have defined water table as a gently curved surface, not a straight line, because the water table that varies from place to place. Okay, so usually the depth to the water table, that is small near the permanent bodies. The depth of water table, that is small near the permanent bodies of surface water, such as the streams, lakes, or the wetlands. So in these types of bodies, the like streams, lakes, and wetlands, the water table, that is not so fluctuating, that remains approximately at a constant level. An important characteristic of the water table is that its configuration varies seasonally and from year to year. Okay, if the rainwater is if rainwater is more, so the water table, that will grow upward, and if the rain is not there, if rain is scanty or the drought is there, so the water table, that will lower down. So that is the configuration of water table, that varies seasonally and from year to year. Because the groundwater recharge, which is the accretion of water to the upper surface of the saturated zone, that is related to the wide variation in the quantity, distribution, and the timing of the precipitation. Okay, so groundwater recharge, which is the accretion of water to the upper surfaces of the saturated zone. So there are different techniques of groundwater recharge, and we will discuss subsequently in the coming lectures or in the coming discussions. And now we will go for the water table maps. So the depth to which the water table can be determined by installing water wells that penetrate the top of the saturated zone just for enough to hold standing water. So the preparation of water table maps, okay, they are very important. The water table map is not horizontal surface, as we have already discussed, and its form and slope that vary depending upon some parameters, and these are very important parameters, like the area of the recharge and discharge, means the location and the area of the recharge and discharge, means which type of area that is, a very mountainous area or very plateau region, or we are dealing with a very planar region, so that will also depend. And the pumpage from the wells, as well as the permeabilities of the aquifer. Okay, so the permeability of the rock body, that will also define the water table maps, that how they will be created in, and it in what shape it will be created. Okay, so these are some important parameters. And the configuration of the water table surfaces, they may be shown by the contour lines. Okay, like we go for the structural maps where we show the contour lines, so the same is the process for the water table maps. They are shown by the presence of contour lines. So in this case, the all points on a given contour, that will represent an equal elevation of the water table. So such a map, that is called water table contour map. So these maps are used in analyzing the direction as well as the rate of groundwater movement. So that is the significance of water table maps. And if we talk about the preparation, so the preparation of a water table map, that requires that only wells that have their well screen placed near the water table, we, water table be used. So if the depth to the water that is measured at a number of such wells throughout the area of study, and if those water levels are referred of reference to a common datum surface such as the sea level. So the common datum, that is the sea level. So the data can be contoured to indicate the configuration of the water table. Okay, so as you can see in the diagram A2, here we are talking about this diagram. Okay, so using the known altitudes of water table at individual wells, and that the diagram A, in which the contour map of the water table surfaces can be drawn, and in the C diagram the direction of the groundwater flow along the water table that can be determined. Okay, so firstly we will go for the water table individual wells, the wells where they have been dug, and the contour mapping of the water table surface they can also be drawn, and subsequently the direction of groundwater flow, that is the motto behind the construction of the groundwater maps, so that can also be recognized. Okay, the determination of the groundwater well, because the flow usually is approximately perpendicular to the contours. So this is a hypothesization, that is the flow that is usually approximately perpendicular to the contours. So in addition to the various practical use of the water table maps, such as the estimating an approximate depth of the purpose well or the proposed well, the configuration of the water table provides an indication of the approximate direction of groundwater flow at a location of the water table. Okay, so we can identify the groundwater flow movement as well as the approximate depth for a proposed well. So these are quite important. So the lines which are drawn perpendicular to the water table contours, that usually indicate the direction of groundwater flow along the upper surface of the groundwater system. Okay, the water table is continually adjusting to changing recharge and the discharge pattern. So that we all know, that is the water table that is fluctuating, it's not a straight line, and that is dependent upon the adjusting to changing recharge and the discharge pattern. Okay, therefore to construct a water table map, water level measurements they can be made at approximately the same time, and the resulting map that is representative only of the specific time in which time we have taken the measurements. Okay, and the groundwater movement. So the groundwater movement system is a whole is actually three-dimensional flow field. Therefore, it's important to understand how the vertical component of groundwater movement that affects the interaction of groundwater and surface water. So it's being a three-dimensional flow field. So a vertical section of a flow field that indicates how potential energies they are distributed beneath the water table in the groundwater system, and subsequently how the energy distribution can be used to determine the vertical components of flow near at a surface water body. So the term hydraulic head that is used. So hydraulic head, which is the sum of the elevation and water pressure, which is divided by the weight density of the water. So hydraulic head, that is a sum of elevation head and the water pressure divided by the weight density of water, that is used to describe the potential energy in groundwater flow system. And for example, in diagram A3, that shows a generalized vertical section of a subsurface water flow, as you can see in the diagram. So if the distribution of a hydraulic head in vertical section is known from the nested piezometer data, the zones of the downward, lateral as well as the upward components of groundwater flow that can be determined. Okay, as you can see in the diagram, and we'll discuss it later. So water that infiltrates at land surface moves vertically downward because of the presence of gravity. Water table to become groundwater. So the water that infiltrates at land surfaces that moves vertically downwards to the water table to become groundwater, as you can see in the diagram. Okay, so the groundwater then moves both vertically and laterally within the groundwater system. So movement is downward and lateral on the right side of the diagram, as you can see in the diagram. The movement is downward and lateral on the right side of the diagram, and mostly lateral in the central part and lateral and upward onto the left side of the diagram, as you can see. And the flow fields such as these can be mapped in a process similar to preparing the water table maps, except that the vertical distribution piezometer need to be used instead of the water table wells. Okay, so flow fields of a aquifer such as these can be mapped in a process which is similar to the preparation of the water table maps, but except that vertically distributed piezometers, they needs to be used instead of the water table maps. So a piezometer is a well that has a very short screen. So water table represents hydraulic head in only a very small part of the groundwater system. Okay, so that is about the piezometer. So a group of piezometers, they are completed at different depths at the same location. So these are referred to as piezometer nets. Okay. So three such piezometer nests, they are located or shown in the figure A3, locations as A, B and C, as you can see in the diagram. Sorry, at this diagram it's not very clear, but you can see in the diagram A, B and C piezometers, they have been installed in the well. Okay, three such piezometers nests, they are shown in the figure. So by starting at water table contour and using the water level data from the piezometer nest, the line of equal hydraulic head, they can be drawn. Okay, as you can see here, as you can see that they are given here 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60. So they are water table contour maps which are drawn for the at equal distance. Similar to drawing the flow direction of a water table maps, flow lines, they can be drawn approximately perpendicular to the lines of the equal hydraulic heads, as shown in the figure A3 as we have discussed. So actual flow fields, they are generally much more complex that has shown in figure A3. Okay, that is the generalized diagram, but actual flow fields, they are generally much more complicated and much more complex. So for example, the flow system of different sizes and depths can be present and they can overlay one another as indicated in A4, as you can see here in A4 diagram. So groundwater flow system can be local, intermediate as well as regional in scale. Okay, so that system can be local in situation or locational, intermediate as well as regional in scale. So much groundwater discharge into surface water bodies is from local flow system. Okay, much groundwater discharge that is into surface water bodies, that is from local fields, local flow field systems. In a local flow system, the water that recharges at a water table high, discharge to adjacent lowland area. So local flow systems, these are most dynamic and the shallowest flow systems, therefore they have the greatest interchange with the surface water. Local flow systems, they can also be underlain by the intermediate and the regional flow system, as we have seen in the diagram. So firstly the local flow system is there, that has followed by the intermediate flow system and subsequently followed by the regional flow system. So this is the hierarchy of the flow system. And water in the deeper flow systems have longer flow paths and longer contact time with the subsurface material. So therefore the water generally that contains more dissolved chemicals, because the water in the deeper flow systems, they have longer flow paths. Okay, that's why they contain uh, all types of sediments as well as the salts, okay, dissolved solids. And the groundwater discharge, so the quantity of groundwater discharge or the flux to and from the surface water bodies, that can be determined for a known cross section of aquifer by multiplying the hydraulic gradient, which is determined from the hydraulic head measurement in wells and the piezometers by the permeability of the aquifer materials. Okay, so the quantity of the groundwater discharge, better known as flux, to and from the surface water bodies, that can be determined for a known cross section of aquifer by multiplying the hydraulic gradient, which is determined by the for the hydraulic head measurement in wells and the piezometers by the permeability of the aquifer material. So permeability is a quantity. We all know about the permeability. So that's a quantitative measurement of the ease of the water movement through which aquifer materials. Okay. And for example, sand is more permeable than clay. Sand is more permeable than clay because the pore spaces between the sand grains, they are larger than the pore spaces between the clay particles. Okay. So this was our basic discussion about the groundwater discharge as well as the water tables and groundwater movement also. So in the next video we will talk about some other parameters or very important factors or features related to the groundwater geology. Okay, thank you.